Hey, this is StarCraft 2 History, part 18, and this one follows swiftly after the third generation of champions and the final miracle. MVP is no longer a threat in the world, and like I said before, Innovation Sulky end up being two of the biggest players in the scene. I think Sulky is the best Zerg player for the year of 2013, and Innovation is the best Terran player until Maru rises up, which is the second season, and even then, there's a decent case for him, and there's also a decent case for Tasia. I actually think we ended up going with Tasia for the Team Liquid awards, and I could see why, because if you just lay out the amount of players Tasia beat, it actually beats out both Maru and Innovation, despite the two of them having having a GSL and OSL victory respectively. Tasia was really fucking godlike towards the end of this year. So this is actually going to be about the rise of Maru, the return of Bomber, and then Jaedong. Right. So if you haven't seen it before, you might want to watch the StarCraft 2 history about the elephant in the room, because this is where that storyline becomes most prevalent in terms of just casting and in terms of community sentiment, because it feels like at this point, like the Kespa players, all of them were going to take over, and they were right to an extent, I believe, but they weren't giving the right amount of due to the upset potential of the older players, or to players that were young and still hadn't risen up yet, like what we're about to see here in Maru. So this is the second season of WCS Korea. This one was run by OSL. There's some fuckery going on with this one, if I remember right. Let me check real fast, but I'm almost certain that in this season of OSL, Rain and Fantasy, both from SK2, were placed in the same group. Yeah, that's right. And the reason this is fuckery is because it was a round robin format, and Rain and Fantasy played last, and because of the way the matches played out, Rain needed to win in order to force tiebreakers, and Fantasy was out no matter what happened. So that's pretty indicative of a match fix. I will say, in Fantasy's defense, it's very unlikely Fantasy would have won against Rain anyway, but come on. If you're going to have two players from the same team, you have to, and in a round robin format like this, you have to have them play first. That's just like basic logic, right? Anyway. So going into this season, a lot of people were believing in the Innovation hype or the Soul Key hype, and both of them actually end up getting to the playoffs and playing again. And this time, Innovation pretty much smashes Soul Key. So by the time we get to the round of 4, everybody thinks Innovation is going to win, and a lot of the sentiment was like somehow Maru was able to make it to the playoffs, somehow Bomber was able to make it to the playoffs. And both of them were considered lower tier Terrans, especially Maru, in the playoffs. Actually, this is a funny point. I'll go back a little bit. So in Group B, there is a group. It's Bomber, Innovation, Flash, and BBYong. And this is a round of 16 group. And famously, Bomber was called a third-rate Terran. And this was, pretty insulting. But in a way, you could kind of understand what people were getting at, just because Innovation and Flash were the two best Terrans at the time, so nobody thought Bomber had any chance. But as it would turn out, Bomber would change the way he had played from 2011 and 2012, and he would use his experience to let him get wins. It was like a very fundamental shift, where he used to be like this mechanical heavy Terran, and now he was going to use all the tricks of the trade to beat out what he perceived to be much better players. And so there's this funny thing that happens in Group B where Bomber and Flash play, and it's right during the patch that is supposed to patch out the Hellbat versus Hellbat meta of Terran versus Terran. And during this patch, like there's some kind of weird miscommunication as to whether or not the new game was going to be played on the new patch or was going to be played on the old patch. And apparently Bomber played either some kind of mental trick, or he legitimately forgot, or he legitimately didn't know. But either way, he pretended that he was playing on the new patch the entire time, assuming the game would be on the new patch. And then when it turned out it's on the old patch, he like tweeted out something like, "Oh God, I fucked up. I was playing on on the new patch the entire time. I'm screwed. And then what ends up happening is Bomber just hard counters the Hellbat build from Flash and then wins the game. And and then Flash kind of tries to do the same thing to Bomber in the second game. Bomber deflects it and then counterattacks and wins the entire thing. And then Bomber also goes on to beat Innovation in the deciding match to get the first seed out of the group. And this is important because this sends Innovation spiraling into Maru in the playoff in the semifinals. So basically, Bomber, that third-rate Terran, beats the two most hyped Terrans from Kespa. So I thought that was always a really funny sort of thing. And Bomber himself actually runs into one of his worst opponents, Rain, in the semifinals, and Rain basically smashes him. Rain was, I think, the best PvT of this time period. He also beat Supernova in the quarterfinals, and then he plays Maru in the finals. As for Maru, well, actually, I'll go back a little bit because there's one more interesting thing to talk about, and that's Group A. In that group, there is Sulky, Symbol, Sue, and Parting. And I'm not going to talk about Parting that much just because Parting's PvZ wasn't that great. Like, Parting for the rest of Heart of the Swarm, basically his PvZ comes down to, can I out-micro the shit out of every Zerg player? If I can do that, I win. If I can't do that, I automatically lose. And so Parting was a player that had some enormous comebacks based off of his micro alone. But in terms of overall gameplay against Zerg, it was pretty bad. But it was really fun to watch if he could micro the shit out of his units. As for the other three, this is where it gets interesting because these three, in my opinion, were the three best Zergs in Korea. The only other Zerg that I think was better than like two of the three was Jaedong, but he's outside of Korea at this point. And so Sulky, Symbol, and Sue were... The way I always thought about this was they filled out very different paths in their careers, basically. That's the way I'll put it. Symbol was the guy who was supposed to win. Not win, but is supposed to be one of the most dominant Zergs in 2012 and going to 2013. And he ends up losing the last finals of Brutal Infestor. He was very good throughout 2012, but in this era, he basically changes as a player because he's on the downslope. So he starts shifting his game style every season, basically. So this is like every quarter. So from spring to winter to fall to summer or whatever the actual seasons are. He's basically trying to constantly change up his style to stay relevant. And it's an interesting like fall to watch because you can really tell Symbol is trying everything he can just to stay good. And it doesn't really work out for him. Sulky and Sue have a strange parallel in between the two of them just because Sulky is a player, I think. I'll go into his own history video, I guess. But basically, I feel like Sulky could have done a lot more than what he did than the results show. I'll say that. And Sulky was the best player, and then Sue would be on the rise, and he would be stuck here for a little bit. But by the end of the year, he would get to his first GSL finals and lose. So I just thought that was an interesting group, just because it collected like the three different generations of Zerg, one from 2012 in Symbol, one from 2013 in Sulky, and the one that would define the rest of StarCraft 2 in Sue. So, go back to Maru. Maru doesn't have a particularly difficult run. Like, he loses to Sue early on in the round of 32, but then beats SOS and Effort. He goes on to beat Trap and Supernova to get into the round of 8. And he's basically been disrespected by a bunch of people, like, just because, like I said, the Kespa hype train was the highest at this point. So a lot of people thought SOS and Effort were a lot better than Maru was, and I'm not exactly sure why. Like, SOS, yeah, he has some really fucking weird ass builds. I'll give him that. But that doesn't necessarily mean he'll match up well against Maru. Was like my biggest contention at the time, like, because you don't really know how SOS matches up against any particular player until you actually see him match up against that player, and then you can kind of figure out how it's going to go, right? So that's always been my biggest contention with SOS. So yeah, fair play. It wasn't upset. It was also just the best of one, but Maru did outplay him pretty comprehensively, and Effort wasn't much. Effort was kind of like overhyped just because of his Kespa. I mean, his Brood War rep. But I will say, apparently, he had like some serious internal issues within his own team. They thought he was a match fixer, so I could kind of understand why he's like very disinterested or very like muted or wasn't all into it, so to speak. And so you get into the semifinals and the finals, and this is one of the few times I'll actually go into the play-by-play of just what happens because this is in my opinion like one of Maru's best runs, and it is so different from the rest of his runs that it's worth mentioning. So, what is it about Maru in general that I think makes him such one of the best players of all time? I think, in my opinion, is that he has a bunch of varied builds, but what makes him special is his execution, his micro, his ability to constantly be on the aggressive and use his superior mechanics to increase the lead that way. So, for instance, there are plenty of players that can multitask, right? Like, I've already pointed out Maru and Gumiho, but when you go into the Heart of the Storm, basically every Terran can do it because of Medevac boost. But the difference between them and Maru was that Maru had the mechanics and the aggressive mindset to push it even further than they did. So not only was he like positioning his units correctly, but he could sometimes push it even further. Like he can make moves that weren't right for anybody else except him because his micro was so exceptional. And unlike, say, somebody like Polt, he had the mechanics to back that shit up. So he never fell back on... He basically never fucked up on his production, never fucked up on his... On all the shit he had to do back home with his mechanics. And that's what made him so much better than so many of the other Terrans. And when we go back to the thing about the varied builds, the thing was, like, Maru could use every fucking unit in the game to an exceptional level. Like... The only unit micro that is better than Maru for any particular person is Dream with Thor drops in 2015. That's it. Maru is as good as or better than every Terran in every aspect you want to think about. And I think I can actually prove that if like I had to. Basically just run through all the fucking VODs. And you'll see Maru defensively, Maru aggressively, Maru on the multitask, Maru in terms of what he's doing at the time. So for instance... This is something... Actually, I'll go into it later because it has much more to do with Deer than it does with this. But basically, Maru does shit that no other Terran can do. And that's why he's, in my opinion, one of the all-time great Terran players and the greatest Terran micro player. And then you have an argument as to whether it's him or Parting that's the best micro player to ever touch the game. And right. So this all comes back to innovation. So what happens in this semifinals, because Innovation was super hyped up to smash Maru. I think like the predictions were like 4-0 Innovation, and actually we see the same weakness Innovation has in the Sulky finals where he kind of chokes, but part of it is Maru's either preparation or luck. It's hard to say with Maru, and the reason I say that is because if you look at the way this series plays out, you would assume it was it was a lot of preparation because of the way each build goes into the next and the build ordering. But if you look at the rest of Maru's career, he never does this again. So it feels really random. And even in the finals, where I thought there was some preparation in there, it actually turns out that was actually just a natural inclination of Maru, and then Parting would punish him for the rest of the time because of it. I'll get back to that a little bit later. So here's what happens. In Game 1, Innovation does not scout. And what I mean by does not scout is like he doesn't scout. He doesn't make a secondary scout. He scouts very early on to make sure like Maru isn't doing a super early cheese, but he doesn't realize that Maru is on one base the entire time as he's going to two bases. And I can assume he doesn't realize this is because he's not really prepared. Like he doesn't have a bunker, and he doesn't have like SCVs ready to repair that bunker. He's just like chilling out and shit. And Maru opens up with a Cloak Banshee, then does a one base all in and kills Innovation. And this is kind of genius. And why I thought at the time it was all prep, because you go into Game 2, and Game 2 you assume, like, Innovation's probably thinking in his mind, okay, I have to prepare for Cloak Banshees, so I am going to get an early Raven. That's what I'm going to do. Maru does do a proxy starport, but instead of going Cloak Banshees, he gets a Medevac, and then he starts doing, like, Marine Hellion drops, and because Innovation had committed so heavily to the Raven, like, once the second drop comes in with even more Marines and Hellions, the game's over. He's instantly dead. So now you go to Game 3. And in Game 3, like, Innovation sticks to his standard style, and then Maru just cheeses him with an 11-11, gets an easy 3-0. And then game 4 is the only game that's contentious in any way. But it kind of shows like innovation was kind of desperate, in my opinion, because they basically use the same composition and similar builds with like hell. It was like Gwangoli Beach. So if you don't know what Gwangoli Beach is, it's like a gigantic lane between the two players, and then you kind of expand upwards, right? And so they play it out, and the general theory behind TVT in this on this map was you go Hellion, Medevac, Marine because you need the mobility, and because everything is in a straight line, the Hellion gets more damage going. So that's the idea, and they both go a similar build. But Innovation does this weird thing in the early parts of the game where he becomes the aggressor, and this is really weird because if you think about the theory of StarCraft 2, if you are using mirror builds in a mirror matchup, that means you will have less units on the attack compared to the defending player. And the reason this is the case is because the reinforcement lines are much shorter for the defending player. So he attacks, and then like fails, and then he's like forced to make a retreat, and then Maru just counterattacks. Maru wins, and that's kind of how it goes. And the reason I call this a choke is because Innovation could have extended the game if he had raised his supply depot, but he doesn't do that. Maru just walks up, and like the supply depots don't go up, and then Maru just does so much heavy damage that the rest of the game doesn't matter. So that's kind of how it goes. As for Maru versus Rain, this is an interesting one because, like I said earlier, I think Rain was still theoretically the best PvT player, and I think he got a little bit into his own head for this finals. So let me explain. The first two games, Rain just does his normal like macro shit and beats the shit out of Maru. Fair play. Maru in the third game does an 11-11 and wins the game. And this is the point I was talking about with parting, because at the time when I was watching this, I didn't realize this was a natural inclination of Maru. But basically, if you beat Maru early on in like a series, he will always revert to an 11-11. And this is something that Parting abuses for the entire career of Maru. And he doesn't reveal this until basically he's retired. So I always thought that was hilarious. But basically, Maru is like super... Maru, when he goes down a series, he'll always do an 11-11 for some reason. And Parting knew this, and that's why Parting always beat Maru. Basically. So that's what happens there. And so you go into the fourth game. So it's now 2-1 in Rain's favor. Right? And then this is the only game where you actually go to a straight macro game. And it looks even for a time. And then Rain makes this big mistake in terms of army positioning that's kind of rare for him, because he doesn't realize that basically Maru has a gigantic arc. So just EMP Bio Vikings would kill his army. And that's what happens. And that's how Maru wins that game. And I actually think here's an interesting point when we're talking about series theory crafting is I think Rain should have stuck to his guns. This isn't like a MVP's fucking with your head moment. This is more like, look, you're at 2-2, but look at the games look at the 3-4 games that have happened. Maru won 1 cheese. Maru barely won a macro game, and you easily won 2 macro games. So, even though the score is 2-2, that could have easily been 3-1. Just run the plan over again. Rain doesn't do this. What happens in Game 5 is Maru does an economic cheese, basically. A very similar idea to what MVP did against Rain, except it's not quite as well set up. But Rain scouts this, obviously, the pain of MVP stealing that semifinals, or maybe it's just an evolution in his play. In either case, he scouts this, and I'm not sure if he ad hocs it or if he decides this was his plan all along, but he tries to go for an all-in, and it fails, basically. Because Rain, he isn't ready to take that step yet. What I mean by that is when you get into 2 years from now, which is, because it's 2013, so in 2015, that's the Rain that can all in and execute that shit. But this Rain was not yet prepared to do that, especially on a final stage. Like I said, in 2012, this is a guy who basically fucked up a force field that would have instantly won him the game against Creator, but he fucked that up. So it feels like when you do an all-in in a huge series like this, there's definitely some kind of nerves that go into play, and that's also a reason why like MVP's like all-in is so ridiculous in retrospect, right? So basically, that's what happens, and you get into the final game. And the final game, let's see here. I believe Rain just does like a very similar thing where he tries to attack Mario again in the early game, and then oh no, what happens in game 6 is I think Rain tries to pray to Inca. Basically, he just tries to DT opening, completely fails against Maru, and Maru just kind of smashes him. So basically, Maru wins this one 4-2. It's an upset. It's also the rise of uh, the third prodigy, so to speak. I guess it's hard to say if you want to put Maru in the same category as Life and Tasia. I mean, he was an incredibly young player, and if we just look at the pure talent, I think the talent is there to put comparable to either of them. But there's always been something weird about Maru in the sense like the rest of his career, basically, he always gets to the semifinals and then like fails basically like a majority of the time. So it's hard to put him on that level. But this is the rise of one of the best Terran players in the world. And now we are going to go across this ocean and we're going to go to Jaedong because Jaedong is. This is actually one of my biggest gripes about this WCS season is basically everybody wanted to see Jaedong versus Flash. And you know what? Even though people don't remember it, Flash and Jaedong were both good in 2013. It just happened because of the way WCS worked and like the place Jaedong was in at the time where he basically wanted to travel the world. EG gave him a huge contract. He didn't want to be trapped in Kespa. Nobody wants to be trapped in Kespa, let's be real. And so he moves to WCS NA. And so you never get the Jaedong versus Flash matchup that we deserved because it would have been sick to see the two of them play at LAN in a big match on stage, especially in 2013 because their play styles would have been fucking fire, I believe, because they were both about the aggressive attack, right? And so that would have been amazing, but we never get to see it. So that's one of my biggest gripes about WCS 2013 is it basically like splits off the two of them so they don't really get to play at the peaks of their StarCraft 2 careers. Like, I guess you can talk about Flash gets a few more, but they are not as extensive as when he was in 2013. And Jaedong quickly falls off after this year. It's like this is like his last final flare up, and then like he doesn't come back again until you get to Brood War, but I'm not going to cover that. And so I'll go over his victories overseas quickly. So there's basically 3 of them, I think, around this time period. There's DreamHack Summer, and this one's pretty fucking legit. He beats Stefano. He beats one of the best European Zergs, still had not yet fallen off. Actually, this is a side tangent, but basically there's another thing that's fucked up about StarCraft 2 history is we never got the Stefano versus Naniwa show match because I think Stefano kind of chickened out. And it would have been sick, especially in 2013 when both of them were still good players. So there's like another what-if scenario, right? And then after that was Lucifron. Lucifron was still a very good Terran player at the time. Still overhyped, I believe, but still a good result. He beats Tasia. That's pretty fucking legit. And like you said with Tasia and Life, like if you remember when I talked about the first matchups of Tasia and Life when they first meet up, Tasia has a very hard time dealing with Life's like mutiling, bailing, aggressive style, and Jaedong is one of the best at that style, especially during this time. He actually was the best at this style just because basically Life kind of like chills, or he doesn't really try very hard. As far as I know, he didn't try very hard, so that's just who Life was. And so Jaedong was very good at the style. And like Sulky was more on the defensive passive end. Jaedong was much more aggressive, so he beats Tasia. And this, in a way, this actually helps Tasia, to be honest, just because what's going to happen is Tasia's going to meet up with Life when Life returns, and he's going to ruin Life's day, basically. So it was good for that Jaedong and Tasia meet here, or continue to meet throughout 2013, for Tasia's case anyway. And then you get to the finals, and then Stardust beats Jaedong in a huge upset. And I remember it was like something ridiculous, like a base trade that could have gone in Jaedong's favor if he had realized like one single detail, but he missed it, and he loses. And this is kind of shocking, I guess, because Stardust was a guy who had come out from cusp of the military to return to pro gaming. He was the only successful player to do it, as far as I know. Like, I know there are some guys coming back in StarCraft 2 now, but it's a very different field. Let me tell you, it's a very different field. Even though Stardust moved to WCS EU, basically, it's a very different field. If you're talking about internationally with all the Koreans and Kespa and all that shit. So, huge respect to Stardust for doing that and making that a thing. But basically, this is like one of Stardust's best moments. And Stardust himself is basically an upset player. So the fact that he was able to win a title this big was really impressive for him. But as for Jaedong, you thought, okay, well, he loses this one. It's not that bad. Goes to WCS NA Season 2, meets Polt, and Polt, tactical mastermind, he'll probably get his own little segment. But basically, Polt completely changes from what he was in 2012 to what he was in 2013. And it's just way better than Jaedong, like tactically speaking, strategically speaking. Jaedong might be the second best player in the world, but against Polt, it's a very bad matchup for him. Just because it's like fire running into an ocean or some shit. It's like he's like you can win all you want there, but you can win in the fights all you want, but Polt's not gonna give you a fight. Basically, he's gonna be counterattacking. He's gonna be playing the money game. He's gonna be playing the position game, and that's how Polt eventually wins. And then Valencia, another good run, beats Vortex, beats JYP, beats Stardust, and then loses to Hyun. Hyun was a worse Zerg straight up than Jaedong at the time, but I remember it was either this tournament or it might have been an MLG later, where basically Hyun says he specifically prepared for Jaedong because he knew Jaedong wasn't going to get to the finals. So good on Hyun, pretty forward thinking, and then he loses there. And now we go into the WCS Season 2 finals, and this is a really fun tournament. This is probably one of the most memorable tournaments of 2013, in my opinion, because this is a tournament where you get basically you get all the best players from different regions, and they're still competitive at this time. So, for instance, like you got Scarlet in Group D, basically beats both Maru. I think he beats him twice. Yeah, she beats Maru twice, and I will admit though, like Maru basically choked. He was not very good at that final. He's not very good at that tournament, not nearly compared to his usual level. But Scarlet was actually very good at the time. Still loses to Alive, which is pretty funny, and kind of shows like it wasn't that easy, WCS NA or WCS EU. And then loses to a Bomber in like what would become a very epic sort of rivalry between the two of them, Bomber and Scarlet, because of the way they play. The way they think about the game, it just created very exciting back and forth matchups between the two. That's the way I'll put it. And as for another interesting part, and probably one of the parts people remember the most, is Naniwa getting out of Group C by eliminating Innovation. And this was pretty fucking sick. So basically, Naniwa kind of grasps the weakness of Innovation, and it actually goes directly into his strength as a player. And Naniwa, in my opinion, his greatest strength wasn't really the macro side of things. And what I mean by macro is like 3-base, passive style, rain style Protoss. For my money, I think Naniwa was always the best when he could go on the aggression. And when he went on the aggression, that actually made his unit macro shine, because I think that was his best aspect of his play. And if you've been following closely, basically you realize, wait, Innovation lost Sulky, who used a bunch of Roachbane all-ins. Then he lost to Maru, who also used a bunch of all-ins. There's a pretty clear weakness here, and Naniwa beats the shit out of Innovation basically for it and gets out of Group C. Now, Group C also had, in my opinion, the most important map of all time. That's Innovation versus Tasia. That's Newkirk, the third game between the two. And the reason I call this the most important game of all time is because it's my favorite game of all time. It's the game that shows the maximum potential of the entertainment value, the strategic value, the tactical value, and the macro aspects of what can be done in StarCraft 2. It basically pushes it to its highest ceiling, and it doesn't ever reach there again, but it's an incredible matchup in my opinion. Still my favorite matchup to this day. Still, I think the best played matchup that's ever been played in StarCraft 2. Basically, the two of them play out of this world because Tasia doesn't like abuse Innovation's weakness. He just goes straight up against Innovation. We're gonna play this straight out, and I'm gonna show you why I am the best late game player of all time. Basically, that's how I would put it because this is what Tasia does. Tasia and Innovation, they go all out, and everybody thinks Innovation's gonna win because everybody always downplays Tasia's skill, especially even though internationally speaking, this guy has the most international lands. Some of them weak, some of them medium, some of them very fucking strong. So in this one, basically, what's gonna happen is the two of them play a TVT, and Innovation takes the mech, and Tasia takes the bio, and this is an important aspect because mech isn't quite as immobile as it once was with the medevac boost, and you can always use Hellbats, Hellions, and basically it's a very strong game that tests the knowledge of the compositions, what they can do, and how to positionally use them. So for instance, every time Innovation was threatening an actual major push, Tasia would flank, and then all of a sudden Innovation realizes his position is untenable to an extent, and he makes a shift. And then because he makes that shift, Tasia's able to make a shift downwards, and Innovation sees that shift, he goes down, and then Tasia goes up, but Innovation meets him. So it's a constant back and forth battle between the two. The entire game is like one of the few split map scenarios where there's constant action on Newkirk all the time because they both realize that they have to get every single edge, especially with Tasia, since this is like a rare time where you see like Tasia not play the passive end because he has to make shit happen because he's playing the bio. And at some point, Innovation makes a careless mistake, or not a careless mistake, but basically there's so much shit going on in the map that Tasia's able to slowly snipe out all the Vikings, and then Tasia realizes this, and somehow in the midst of like 300 APM, where like 50 minutes into the game of nonstop action, he kind of calculates the fact that Innovation has not rebuilt his air army, so he goes Cloak Banshee in like the 50th minute, and with his own Viking Armada, and then wins the game. It's an incredible series. I mean, it's an incredible game, the best ever played in StarCraft 2. So that's why I'll always remember this tournament in particular. And now we go into the playoffs. So Jaedong beats Naniwa. Jaedong and Naniwa, I think that matchup was pretty bad for Naniwa in general, Zerg versus Protoss. So just because of the way that matchup works, it's very hard to do micro to micro yourself out of death, basically, as a Protoss, unless you were Parting, who, in my opinion, best micro player Protoss ever had. So tough luck for Naniwa there. As for Tasia plays Rain, and Rain, like I said, best PvT player ever. Guy who thought he was the best late game player ever. He runs into Tasia. Tasia basically crushes him in the late game, where he basically gets a very small lead. He gets a small lead in the early game, and then he never lets up the entire rest of the game. Kills like 38 observers. He completely makes Rain blind. And if you think about the way Rain loses to Maru, it's because of a bad position army in the game 4, right? And basically that's what Tasia does, is because he's constantly limiting and destroying Rain's vision. Rain realizes like he cannot take a fight, but eventually he's going to have to take a fight, and Tasia has already won the fight before the fight happens, basically. So it's an incredible match if you want to see Tasia's passive style in action, because this is basically proof. Basically, we have had Tasia run into Innovation, probably one of the best late game players at the time in TVT, and then you have to run into Rain, the best late game PvT player, and Tasia like smashes both of them. So that's another really good game, and it's another one that's like really memorable among Tasia's catalog. He then loses to Bomber. Bomber was a TVT specialist, and unlike Innovation, had a lot of experience playing with Tasia for a long period of time, so he kind of knew like some of the aspects of Tasia. And Tasia himself like didn't play quite as good as he did against Innovation, so Bomber takes that one out. And then you have Jaedong versus First. First was all right. Like I said, he's bordering on like top 6, top 7 Protoss in Korea maybe, but he's not like the Six Dragon era of like Brood War, or it's not like the 6 top Protoss is in 2015, where like they're all legit, like almost majority of them are like championship contender level players. First was a strong, solid Protoss, but he wasn't great. And then you go into the finals and Jaedong versus Bomber. And this is like another heartbreak moment for Jaedong. This is another second place finish. And it's strange because if you think about it, like if you just like talking about TVZ, I think Teja's TVZ is better than Bomber's, but Bomber does something very romantic in a sense. That's the best way to put it. Because this is like I said, like I talked about the elephant in the room, and the entire thing was about how like one of the aspects that ends up happening, the way that manifests itself in the community is basically everybody talking shit about the old players, right? And another aspect that kind of manifested itself in Korea was basically these guys ran away from Brood War. That's true to an extent, but they also had gained experiences and they had made new challenges in that time. That's something like basically Oz says in like his speech in the first OSL, where like we didn't run for Brood War, we were the first ones to take up a new challenge. I think that was the quote. And basically Bomber lays it all down on the line here. And what I mean by that is like he pulls out some of the oldest fucking builds, archaic builds, way before like Jaedong's time. It's like we're talking like Marine tank pushes, we're talking about like triple barracks, talking about like a bunch of like really old school shit. And Jaedong has no idea how to deal with this because Jaedong's never seen it because this shit didn't exist when Jaedong transitioned over. And Bomber basically beats him. And Jaedong, like, I actually do feel like this is a choke in a sense, but on another sense, it really depends on how much information Jaedong had about that previous era. And I don't really know how much he did because Bomber was using a bunch of stuff that was like really out of date. And Bomber like completely sideblinds Jaedong, wins that tournament, and this is the biggest tournament victory of his career. And I remember Bomber basically like understanding how overhyped he was, and that was always like an interesting moment because it's like there was always so many expectations about me, but I never really lived up to them. All I had was like these pains and these struggles, but because of those pains, because of those losses, because of the struggles, the victories I do have become all the more meaningful. And I've always thought that was like a good sentiment to have for somebody who had struggled for so long. So that was Bomber's victory. That was like that third-rate Terran supposedly wins out WTS Season 2 Finals in a grand fashion. Biggest tournament of his life. And a tribute to all the work that Bomber had put into the game at that point. Because like I said, that finals is basically just Bomber using a bunch of old builds that he had built up from experience from all the years he had been playing StarCraft 2. So that one was always a romantic sort of finals in a sense. And romantic in both ways because this basically solidifies Jaedong as the Kong of the era and kind of foreshadows the rest of the Zerg race in a sense, because guess who's going to come up soon after this? 1 year from now it's Sue, and then after him it's Dark, and after him it's Buell. So there's a lot of Zerg Kongs coming down the pipeline, right? And as for Jaedong, it was actually a very strange. If you talk about a StarCraft 2 career, especially his peak, which is 2013, it's a very strange sort of enigma because Jaedong, we know Jaedong in Brood War was a championship level player. This guy had fucking killer instinct. So what exactly happened between Brood War and StarCraft 2? Nobody really knows. Nobody can really answer that, but it's always an interesting mystery. And I've always felt like my own personal take was pressure never truly goes away. And what I mean by that is you just learn how to deal with it better. You're never able to always ignore all of it. And sometimes it just breaks you. It breaks you like, because this was like a different environment. Maybe Jaedong really wanted to win one for EG. Maybe he felt like the fans' expectations were at an all-time high because these were new types of fans. These weren't like just Korean fans. This wasn't just Pro League and the OSL and the MSL. This was on an international stage, basically, with way more international viewers watching. Maybe that had a part of it. Maybe it was his lack of experience because Jaedong seems like a guy who had to really practice, had to really grind out things in order to learn them, in order to understand them. It's hard to say, but it's an interesting thing to ponder. Anyway, this ends it for this video. I'll see you guys later.